Hey everyone, producer here. Before we get into today's episode, a quick heads up. This week's episode is a rerun, but it's one we really love and think is worth revisiting, whether it's your first time hearing it or not. Over the coming months, we will be sharing more of our favorite moments from the nearly 90 episodes we've put out so far as we take a little time behind the scenes to rework and reimagine what the next version of the show will look like. So thanks for being here and let's get into it. For this first re-release, we're taking it back to our second Cut the Shit live show, where we had 6 IT expert panelists break down Zero Trust architecture, what it is, and how you can implement the security strategy within your business. This episode is packed full of expert advice, good security knowledge, and is still incredibly relevant to the current cybersecurity landscape. It's one of my favorites, and I hope you enjoy this episode.
This is our second annual Cut the Shit event. Again, for those who were here last year, thanks for coming back. We've got a little bit different topic to cover today that we think is pretty topical. And like last year, we've got a great panel. For those of you who know me, I'm not the most technical person in the world. I didn't grow up as an engineer. I'm a business person who knows a little bit about technology. Some might say enough to be dangerous. I guess it depends on how you look at it. But I have found some people to talk who do know a whole lot about it, both in terms of the technology itself, kind of at an engineering level, if you wanted to get into the weeds or the complicated stuff, also at a real strategic level from a consulting basis. And so, our subject today is Zero Trust architecture. In keeping with our sort of irreverent approach, it's ZTA, what the fork. If anybody's seen Good Place, they use the word fork instead of the original F word, so that's what we went with. Today, we're going to break this into 3 parts. We'll talk. The panelists will talk for about 30 or 40 minutes, and then we'll take questions at the end. The goal, I've gotten kind of again broken into 3 parts. Sort of the first one, Zero Trust architecture. What the hell is this thing? Then second, why all the fuss? And last, how do we get there if we want to get there? The assumption coming in for the people in the room is we've got some incredibly technical people mixed with some highly skilled business people who happen to deal with technology, right? So that's a wide range of technical know-how and the kinds of problems that you're facing around security. Some of you are in the trenches, so to speak, and down in the weeds. Some of you are at the budgeting and the strategic level or having to play the translator role with boards and other executives who literally don't know anything about this stuff. All they know is it seems like a hell of a lot of money that we're having to spend on this stuff, and they're scared to death about what might happen in terms of exposure. So with that range in mind, the questions will cut across that, I hope, so that wherever you sit, whether you're a highly technical person or a business person who deals with technology, that you'll get something out of this. So with that, let's get started. And I thought we'd start by, let's define our terms and level set a little bit around what we're talking about as it relates to Zero Trust. So I'm going to call on, before I do that, why don't we let everybody introduce themselves real quick. I didn't even think about that. You guys have seen the panelists' names and bios, but you may not have looked at it, so we'll give each of them a chance real quick to introduce themselves. So I'll start here on my right, and let's work around. John, why don't you start for us?
Sure. My name is John Moore. I work for a company called Clearwater that was founded here in Nashville, I think over a decade ago now. I have multiple roles there. I'm our chief risk officer. Also have responsibility for our consulting team as well as our customer success team. We are now the largest pure play cybersecurity and compliance firm focused on healthcare in the United States.
I'm Sam. I'm a sales engineer at Jamf, and I've been working there for a couple of years now. I mostly work with our management software, but also we've gotten into the security space over the last couple of years, and I'm excited to be here today.
I'm Itzik Igor from a company called Incentra, partner of Plow. I'm personally based in Sydney, Australia. But we have some offices around here in the US. And my responsibility predominantly these days is the CIO and the CISO at Incentra.
My name's Travis Whitmill. I'm with CRC Insurance. So we're a specialty wholesale broker. I focus on the placements of cyber liability programs for all different types of industry sectors and really structuring that given the insurance exposure and things along those lines.
My name's James Golden. I work as the Director of Technical Development here at Plow, and I assist organizations moving towards a zero trust model and handle all the intricacies and complexities there within.
I'm Kermit Graham. You heard that right. It is Kermit, just like the frog. I work for a company, Fortinet. I've been in the public sector business for about 30 years. I currently cover what we call state and local education east. So I cover all the SLED customers east of the Mississippi.
Thank you, guys. So as you can see, we've got a range of experience and focuses in terms of roles and responsibilities, and that's by design. So hopefully out of that, maybe we'll get a little disagreement. I doubt it. Maybe I'll try to see if I can't provoke some, if possible. But certainly different perspectives on the same issue, right? So holding that up to the light and taking a look at it from different chairs, if you will. So as I said, so let's start by defining our terms and let's level set a little bit on what we're talking about. So I'm going to call on Itzik first to give us. Can you give us a brief overview of what zero trust architecture actually is?
Thanks, Brian. I like to look at zero trust as essentially a paradigm shift in the way we look at information security. We used to look at information as location-centric. So if you go through a VPN or you're in the office, it's a trusted environment, and whatever you do there is trusted, and you don't have to authenticate again or do anything like that, and you can have access to all the information you need, including some sensitive information. But with the shift that we've seen over the past couple of decades actually, with the way that we interact with the information, with the way we work with data, the way we access it, BYOD, and post-COVID as well, working from anywhere, it's no longer possible. So it's a complete shift to bring the security and the focus on the user, identity, on the data, applications or workloads, and the networks.
Perfect. That's a very good summary. And I think that word paradigm is an important one to keep in mind, right? So we've had customers ask us, do we sell zero trust as an example? And that's not necessarily a wrong question, but zero trust is not something you can buy, right? It's a way of thinking about security. You might have a bunch of programs and approaches and processes you do that make you, maybe you're adhering to a zero trust methodology, but you can't really buy it. So with that background, John, why don't you help us a little bit? I mean, Itzik kind of alluded to it, but talk a little bit about kind of how we got here, and maybe given your background, weave a little bit of some of the regulatory pieces in there as well.
Sure, and I assume I got asked that question because I'm old. Back in the day, in addition to having to walk to school uphill both ways in a snowstorm, the first computer I saw filled a room, and you interacted with it with a keyboard, and there would be a printer that would print out responses, and no one was going to walk off with that computer. It's huge. And we were just starting to connect computers at that time, and no one was really concerned about security at all. To the extent that you encountered anything related to security, maybe there was a password and a username, and probably if you got the file of those passwords which were stored somewhere, cracking them was not a difficult problem. And that included government computers too at that time. I knew a guy who did the first work cracking passwords for the DoD. Kind of flash forward into the 80s, we started to get those interconnections. We had the foundations of the internet, ARPANET, were starting to be created. And it turns out during that period, if you had a modem and you war dialed, you could get NORAD, and you could crack in and start a thermonuclear war. And if you don't get that joke, that means you're really young and you don't know the movie War Games. But I bring that up because that movie got credited with the term firewall, purportedly, right? Even though firewalls, as we know them today, weren't really even invented till much later in the late 80s and early 90s. So this notion of perimeter defense technically didn't even exist until the 90s. But at that time, we started to have problems, right? Computer worms and viruses, and these things started to emerge as problems. Hacking had become a problem. This guy named Mitnick was wreaking havoc. And folks started to think more about security, and the World Wide Web started to come up, and internet, and we came up with this walled garden idea, or the moat and castle idea, or some people would say the M&M idea. It's hard on the outside and it's soft on the inside. And that's the way security sort of existed for some time. During the 90s and into the early 2000s, when I was in graduate school, it was still like that. The first security book I had was a picture of a castle with a moat around it. And I think that's what every security book looked like in the 90s. In the early 2000s, some CISOs from around the world, called the Jericho Forum, I think it was, got together and said, hey, you know what, this really isn't working out so well. If someone gets inside the wall, they have everything, right? They could move anywhere they wanted to, and this is becoming problematic for us from a security perspective. We should think about a perimeterless notion of security. So instead of thinking about the wall, we need to think about this as without a perimeter, or the early concepts of zero trust. You flash forward a few years, and a fellow named Kindervag, I think I have that right, from Forrester coined the term zero trust, but it wasn't for a few more years, probably 4 years later, something like that, 5 years later, when Google first came out with their Beyond Corp model, which was really kind of that first implementation of the zero trust model, and at least that anyone saw outside of maybe some interesting organizations that might have adopted those concepts earlier. So you take that and you flash forward a little bit sooner, and you start to have the idea of NIST publishing the document around zero trust. We have a presidential directive directing all of our federal organizations to adopt zero trust. Based on my experience with the federal government, in a few $1 billion in about 10 years, they'll all have adopted that. But it's starting to become more and more of a recognized approach to deal with the changing world we live in, and that changing world is one where most folks out there now are at least working remote part of the time, if not all of the time. Every organization you deal with is dealing with or using services in the cloud that are outside of their perimeter defenses. We have a lot of attacks that are ID-based attacks that circumvent the typical identity management and access control that we have. So that's kind of where we are in the world today, and so this is a really a new way of looking at how we should think about security.
Excellent. Okay, so that's the background. I mean, some of you may have already known all that. Some of you may have not known much of that at all. So hopefully that gives you at least sort of how we got to where we are, right? So we know what this thing is, and we know kind of how we got here. So, I mean, everyone's already talked about it like it's fantastic. So a skeptic might say, why is it so special? So let's spend a little bit of time on that. So James, let's start with you. In your opinion, why is everybody so excited about this? Why isn't it just another buzzword or a way to sell something to somebody? Why is it a better mousetrap?
So there's a multitude of reasons, but if I had to pick a few, to start with, it's more of a proactive approach and less of a reactive approach as it relates to security, combined with microsegmentation and the analysis of the telemetry coming in for every resource access attempt, and that being analyzed every time, provides much more visibility and actionable information to the IT staff, even in the organization, freeing them up to focus more on the organizational needs and using technology to benefit the organization and less just putting out fires. Additionally, combined with single sign-on, single identity models, you put yourself in a much, much more secure environment so that if identity, for example, is compromised, since that's only one piece of the zero trust model being analyzed, you're able to cut them off from pretty much all resources, regardless of where they are, where they're coming from, and bringing in that telemetry data from a endpoint perspective, either for risk detections due to compromised antivirus, for example, or any number of elements. But basically, it allows the IT staff to approach security in much more of a soloed fashion in terms of services we're trying to protect, and much away from the whole, if they're inside the office and connected to a VPN, they're good. And I think that benefit alone is dramatic.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that the perimeter-based approach made a lot of sense, and maybe Kermit, I'll get you to talk about this in the context of networking, made a lot of sense once upon a time when those data assets and really the assets of the company were all in one place, right? Which isn't, I mean, to your point, John, isn't the case really for any of us anymore. But once upon a time, that did used to be at least fairly true. Maybe not 100%, but pretty close to it. So let's kind of dive into a couple of different areas, in terms of thinking about zero trust and how does it help reduce risk better than legacy approaches. Kermit, talk to us a little bit about, from a network perspective, in kind of the way things are operating today. Talk a little bit about that, why it's a better approach.
Well, for starters, I'd come back and I'd ask, what network? If you think about what John did and talked about in the journey we have come through, you and I talked about that prior to all this, right? You had the mainframes, dumb terminals to let's distribute that out to the PCs, but still networking came around and storage and resided on the PC. So I would say the same thing holds true of the network. What is a network today, right? Remote work has completely changed that dynamic of the perimeter. We've got people that are, probably doing, I think you might be recording video, but I know there were people doing con calls earlier from the back patio, not just in the office anymore. So the dynamics of what was the network has completely changed. Our smartphones completely have changed the dynamics. There is no more perimeter, if you really think about it, because now folks are storing stuff there, meaning on your devices. They're storing stuff in the cloud, and you're traversing things other than what used to be deemed the local area network. Now, don't get me wrong, they're still traversing the LAN, but I would offer that you probably have more employees traversing the public wide area network or the internet than you do the local area network. So there's been a lot of things that have changed from that perspective. So you have to go back, and I appreciate you said the paradigm, because there is not a box that you can check of what you're going to buy to sit there and secure whatever it is, because every single company is at a different place within their journey of trying to get this zero trust architecture, because it is just that. It's an architecture and it's a paradigm. It's not a product. I'd be more than happy. I'd be interested to find out what you told your customer when they said, do you sell zero trust? Absolutely, I do. Absolutely, I do. But then you need to sit down and start mapping that journey out, because it really is a journey. But you have to start with that paradigm in mind and knowing that you're never going to get to 100%.
So Sam, let's take it from the device side. So Kermit kind of walked us through, the evolution of the network, and does that word even make sense anymore in the context of the way connectivity occurs? Maybe it does. Maybe it's different for sure. I think the device is different too. So let's talk a little bit, and you have a particular expertise on the Mac side of the house, but let's try to talk a little more broadly, just from a device perspective in general, as you think about this thing.
Yeah, I'll do the best that I can with talking broadly. Obviously, like my background is mostly in Mac, but we definitely have like an entire shift that has happened, just like everybody else has said. We have to make sure that we're protecting on many different layers to get this zero trust option. So we're protecting it at the identity level and making sure that we're basically creating like a microtunnel to be able to access resources from work, whether that's through an application on your personal or BYO device, or it's through a specific application on your Mac or on a computer, just generally. We've also got the ability to do that on websites. So we're protecting you no matter where you're accessing the specific resource, whether that's a company resource or just an application that you're using for work, to be able to keep you safe and make sure that you're keeping all of the work content safe as well.
Yeah, and the interesting thing, she mentioned BYO, bringing your own devices. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the idea that you would bring your own anything to work and connect it to anything at work the concept didn't even exist, right? I mean, first of all, the first computer I had was a desktop, so I had to lug that thing into the office, and I wouldn't have been able to connect it to anything anyway, so it wouldn't have even mattered. So back to the point around thinking more broadly about the network. Well, a network traditionally was a bunch of devices connected together, right? And so it was assumed that they were all controlled and within your world. So that's another one of those planes that's completely been obliterated by the bring your own phenomenon, which I can imagine if you're managing IT at a fairly large organization is a gigantic pain in your ass. It has to be, right? Because people, they're getting on, they can get access to resources through all kinds of mechanisms, right, that you can't control. And so that's a scary thing. So Travis, give us, we're gonna step away from sort of a technology vector and into, I call it a risk management or risk transfer vector, which is insurance. Talk to us a little bit about what do the insurance companies think about zero trust in the context of cybersecurity insurance?
So really, when you think about the shift that everyone's talking about here with the cyber insurance marketplace, it really took place prior to 2020 and COVID-19. Everything was much easier to quote and bind policies. I mean, quite frankly, insurance carriers were not looking for any information whatsoever surrounding the cyber hygiene of, let's call it, accounts under 150, maybe even 200 million in gross sales down. You could bind policies with business name, website, and revenue, which is alarming to think of that. COVID-19 came in, and as the shift in remote working activity took place, all the claims started mounting because a lot of those companies were not properly set up. So then all of a sudden you had the hockey stick reaction to that, which was insurance companies started hiking rates. You started seeing 100% rate increases on cyber policies. Even if you didn't experience a cyber event, you still were taking on rate because all of the ships rise with the rising tide. So you're now in this spot where we're 2 to 3 years in where rate increases were taking place. In order to qualify for insurance, these companies had to start adopting controls, which follows suit with what we're talking about today. They're on this roadmap to zero trust, potentially, if they have the correct partners, which is then resulting in lower loss ratios for the insurance carriers. And now we're already seeing another hockey stick result of that, where insurance carriers are chasing premiums back down to earth to try to retain business upon renewals. A lot of capacity has entered the space, so multiple options that you can get quotes from, which is then in return causing a lot of competition within the space. And so within a 2 to 3 year timeline, we went from a huge increase in rates to now you could see 30, 40, 50% rate decreases on your insurance policies due to the implementation of these controls that everyone's really talking about and accomplishing these types of goals in mind.
Yeah, so Travis and I were talking about that earlier, and we think this might be an overreaction as well, because I don't know about you, but we're not exactly hearing about a huge drop-off in cybersecurity incidents in terms of companies. I mean, they just seem to keep going up and up. Now there's more awareness of it now than maybe there was in the past, but I don't sense that that the risk has really gone down that much. I mean, you can mitigate it or prepare yourself a little better than you could before, but I don't know that rate decrease is going to stick.
I agree. There's a lot of situations right now where you're selling higher limits of insurance, lower deductibles for less premium than what they were paying last year. But it does feel that it's going to be short-lived given the ransomware severity and everything that everyone's talking about in the marketplace.
So we've got a little bit of context on zero trust and sort of why it's, how we've gotten to here and sort of what the state of the union is today, and given the necessity of having a paradigm shift, as Kermit described. I don't think you really have a choice, but to be on a zero trust journey. You're either acknowledging that or you're not, but you're on one, whether you like it or not. We all are. This is the game we're in, and so I think it's important to think about wherever you are on that path. How do I get further along, right, and protect my organization, put us in a better position to be, from a risk management perspective? Because it's always important to remember one of the key principles of zero trust is assume a breach, right? That's a pretty new idea, right? And somewhat dispiriting if you think about it. I don't know about you, but I remember my CEO once upon a time asking me, what was the chance of us getting? This will tell you how long ago it was. What's the chance of us getting hacked? And I said 100%. And he said, "Are you serious?" And I said, "I'm totally serious." And he said, well, what do we do to prevent that? I said, I just told you it's 100%. There's no way to prevent it. Our only, it's like if you're a football fan, this is like trying to block Lawrence Taylor in his heyday, right? You couldn't stop the guy. You could only hope to contain him, right? That's sort of what we're dealing with here. So with that, James, let's start with you first, and let's talk a little bit kind of if someone's really early in the game, right, and they've got, everybody's got some security measures in place already, but they may not be thinking about it, in a strategic or in a sort of very defined method. What are some of the first steps a company should think about as they're going down, if they want to get on this path?
First step would definitely be identification of critical services relating to the organization. You have to know what your users are accessing, where they're accessing it from, how data is traversing through your existing network, and identification of those critical services to the organization. That's first and foremost. Past that, you start diving into the authentication mechanisms used and the security solutions used, and basically working towards those security solutions being able to feed into each other to be able to interact and judge that access attempt accordingly against the zero trust model. So in terms of taking an organization that may not be very far down that path, the answer of where to start would be service identification, how your users are accessing your data, and looking towards modern solutions to replace those existing access methodologies. So, in short, if you're able to access your company information with nothing more than a username and password, you have a problem. You have a very big problem.
Itzik, I want to bring you in on this real quick, just to think about it from, I'm reminded of something that Frank Platt said last year at this meeting, and it was talking about understanding the business's assets and using that as a starting point to think about risk definition and building a security sort of paradigm or a security approach around those. And I don't think that's in conflict with what James said, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that again, depending on who you're talking to within your company.
Not at all. It's not in conflict at all. And if you bring down zero trust to two fundamental basics, is one, least privilege, and the second one is assumed breach, everything flows from there. And then you have your policies that you need to implement, which touch all of those, from assets to devices to users, identities, and all that comes to it in the network, and then how you approach that. So what I would do, and what I would suggest for people to do, is start with understanding what you've got, as James started saying, and really get someone that can help you identify where your gaps are. Because there's no question there are gaps, right? The question is where you are as an organization through this journey, and how you're going to get there in the least painful way, to be frank.
So let's talk a little bit about least privilege, because we haven't used that expression yet, and I think it's one, you may already know it, or you may be thinking, you may know what it means, but let Kermit talk a little bit about from a network perspective, and then I'd like to hear somebody talk a little bit about either from an identity or an access perspective.
Yeah, I'll even further simplify things, right? Because if you go back to how this all started, it's pretty simple. Somebody needs a piece of information from somewhere. Now it's changed how we get that information, right? I call an application, who may call 10 others, containerization, whatnot. But from that perspective, you start with users, devices, and then access, and then access to whether it be on the network and or to specific data. If you boil it down, it's really that simple. So from a network perspective, or if I look at it from a cyber or ZTA perspective, who is the user? Is the device they're on authenticated and authorized to be there? Are they authorized and authenticated onto the network? And then are they authenticated and authorized to get where they want to be? To me, it's that simple. Now,
and no more. Least privilege means nothing more than that, right?
Nothing more than that, right? But if you don't understand what your users are doing and where they're going and who should be getting to what, it doesn't matter what you do, because the bad guy's going to get in. You're going to allow somebody access to information they're not privileged to, and then that's where the games begin.
And Brian, if I may add just one thing, I think zero trust takes it one step further, and not only once you identify your device and the right place you need to be and the right user you are, even if you authenticate it once, it doesn't mean that you're going to be there forever, right? You're going to have to go back and re-authenticate time and time again, depending on your configuration and obviously what works in your infrastructure. But there's one more important element, which is not just the user, not just the identity of the user, it's also the identity of the application, the workloads. those workloads also authenticate. If you those of you who have done recently, try and get an application on the Azure Workplace or get any application to install on your infrastructure, it also asks for certain permissions to have on your infrastructure, and you allow or don't, or limit it to the level you're comfortable with.
So I'm going to go a little bit out of order here. That if as a non-technical person, I hear a lot. This sounds like a lot of overhead for the user. So what is this? Tell me a little bit about what this means from a user experience perspective. Sam, why don't you start first, and then James, I'll just kick it over to you.
Yeah, I can speak specifically about the tools that Jamf has, just because that's what I have the most experience with. But basically, there's a really light lift on our end because of the fact that there's an application on the device that's doing risk assessment based on whether or not somebody is logged in with their identity, their cloud identity provider or Azure, whomever you're using, to be able to access the applications that the IT admin has given access to or permissions, and that is going to do real-time risk assessment each time somebody is going to access something new or different. And it creates, again, those microtunnels that I kind of talked about. The microtunnel is going to give you access to that application or piece of content that you're trying to look for. So it's only going to give you access if you are meeting all of the different criteria that is needed to be able to get that particular access piece. I said access like 97 times, but that's what we're talking about.
It's kind of the important. It's kind of the crux of the issue. Right?
It is.
So James, take it to a different level. Take it to the admin perspective. So I'll call it the admin user experience. If that sounds a little bit like a contradiction in terms, but it's not, right? Because one of the things that least privilege, or sort of privilege access management, the admin side's really, really different than what it used to be. Because the assumption was if you're an admin, you're a good guy.
No, absolutely. So to your point, previously the older model would be a user, either an administrative staff would be defined as having an administrative access across the board. They may use a separate account to facilitate that access and have to maintain those two accounts. The new model that seems the most appropriate is to use things such as privileged identity management, where you do not have admins. You have people who are eligible to become admins, and they have to provide justification why they need that role, and you can put approval processes in place, but it's just the next level of least privilege, because it's not only can you only access the resources you absolutely need to, you can only access those resources after an approval process or some type of workflow to run through it.
And often for a certain amount of time, right?
Yeah.
I mean, usually that's a time-based, not always,
yes.
but oftentimes, usually a time-based mechanism.
Yes, absolutely. During that kind of privileged identity management, you would tell why you would actually need that resource, how long you need it for, and you only have that role for that amount of time. Privileged access management is along the same kind of concept, but more around device access and less around actual administrative roles. But from an administrative perspective, once implemented successfully, it's infinitely easier to maintain going forward. It's just kind of crossing that hump. And I did want to comment briefly on the user's experience as you move towards a zero trust model. One key element I cannot stress enough: if you're not working towards a single identity model with single sign-on, start there. Because if you implement solutions like this, as was pointed out, you're re-authenticating every time you access a service, whether you know it or not. If you don't know that that's happening, that means it was designed correctly, because you have single sign-on running in the background. The users don't see an auth prompt, even though one is occurring, and all that telemetry data is being analyzed to determine their risk and if they're allowed to access that resource.
So play a little devil's advocate there. Isn't that potentially creating an old walled garden model? Because if they're able to get in the front door by a single sign-on, don't they now have access to those multiple applications?
Only if you're using only identity as your telemetry data. So again, going back to the zero trust model, the whole idea is to include as much telemetry data as you possibly can. For example, where did this user last access this resource from? How long ago was it? What device was it? Is that device in our compliance policies? Is it meeting our thresholds? The amount of organizations that exist right now that a jailbroken iPhone can very easily access company resources is unreal. And if you don't understand the potential danger there, we can have a talk after this, and I'll be more than happy to explain it.
So that I wanted to bring that in because there is a geographic aspect to this that really hadn't been mentioned yet, but that's an important piece of data. Where are you actually trying to access from? And obviously you can try to hide or, fake where you're coming from. There's a lot of that going on, but that's just another way of trying to figure out if you are who you say you are.
Yes, and honestly, in the real zero trust model, that would actually get you flagged faster. Because if you could not physically travel from one location to another and your login data is suggesting that your previous login was from Nashville and all of a sudden you're logging in California and you were in Nashville 5 minutes ago, that is a red flag and your account should be disabled across the board. And when you combine that with a single identity model, you've now locked that compromised identity out from every service your organization offers. No, absolutely. Absolutely. If you're mixing legacy solutions for remote access against a zero trust model, don't do that.
Yeah, well, that's something I did want to talk about was the transition from legacy to zero trust. The primary tool of the legacy model was the VPN, which causes lots of issues in the interim period, right? Crossing the chasm, so to speak. So we can get there. John, I want to kind of jump to you and I think it relates to this, which if I'm on that side and I'm thinking about trying to figure out what we have that works with zero trust and what doesn't, where might I start in thinking about where would be my problem areas if I want to try to go further down this path than where I am today? I've got some legacy tools in place and I've got some zero trust friendly tools.
Right. Well, that's sort of the question is what do we have? And again, I think I forget who mentioned it, but we start with understanding what we have, and what we have includes a lot of the things. It's our resources, our data, our existing technology that we have in place. And a lot of times, again, what the problem is, people think that I need to introduce a new technology in order to introduce zero trust into my environment. Most folks that you'll talk to who are on this journey, and journey is really the right word for it, is we're trying to introduce the concept of zero trust. We're going to do that through our zero trust architecture. Typically, the first thing we want to do is look for those initial things we can do. For example, multi-factor authentication, right? If I have multi-factor authentication and I can start to incorporate that into all of the applications within my environment, I'm on that zero trust journey. If I have firewalls and those firewalls allow me to shut people off based on the risk analysis that's being done by my, let's call it policy decision element, right? My policy decision point, that's going to allow me to implement zero trust. So I need to understand what resources I do have available, what can I do to start that journey before and get some of those initial low-hanging fruit gains to demonstrate the benefits of zero trust.
But it does point out, there are challenges along the lines. You mentioned multi-factor authentication, which, as Travis will tell you, at least a year ago when we were talking about this, was becoming, there were insurers who wouldn't write cybersecurity policies unless you had MFA. So you can roll out MFA, that's great. If you don't have single sign-on and you've got MFA in place.
I hope you like MFA prompts.
And it's not biometric. You're having people having to get codes for every time they try to access something new. Your business partners are going to be pissed, right? They're not going to like that very much at all.
Yeah, that's a big problem if you're in the change management aspect of zero trust. And we sort of talked about a number of different issues. When I think about, you mentioned, isn't that just the walled garden thing? It really is, except it's like the walled garden on steroids now, because I have a wall around the town, and I have a wall around my neighborhood, and I have a wall around my house, and I have the front door to my house locked, and I have the doors to the rooms in my house locked, and so forth and so on. And so each time I'm going through one of those gates, through those different walls, there's an evaluation being made about whether or not I should be let in. If I have single sign-on in place, a lot of that throughput is allowed to happen.
The friction goes down.
Yeah, the friction goes down, and those decisions, that risk analysis, that dynamic policy is being enforced and allowing me to pass through seemingly frictionless. But if I don't have those things in place, I can put up a lot of walls and create a lot of friction very quickly and piss off a lot of users. I think I'm allowed to say piss off, right?
Yeah, you are. Cut the shit.
Yeah, exactly.
How do you get DoorDash?
Let's close it out. Let's talk a little bit about sort of what I'll call, I want to talk about some budget aspects, but also want to talk a little bit about education at the C-suite level and sort of teaching what ideas around teaching internally or educating internally around these concepts, because the people sitting in this room may feel comfortable with these concepts, but that doesn't mean your operations people do, or your CFO does, or your CEO, or your clinical managers out in the field, that kind of group. And I'm not saying they all have to be experts, but they probably need to understand what you're trying to do here. So because if you are in a change, some sort of transformation or a change plan, it could get bumpy, right? You can't just, you're changing the engine while you're flying the plane, so to speak, on some of the stuff. So with that, Itzik, why don't you talk a little bit about that? I just want to get your initial kind of reaction to that concept around selling internally as it relates to zero trust.
Yeah, absolutely. Adoption and change management is a critical component of zero trust implementation and adoption. If you piss off your CFO, your CEO, you're not going to go far, right? And there are those users that you'll piss off because they're used to putting in their login once and that's it. They don't need it to do it anymore, right? But now, obviously, I think we're seeing a shift also in a mind of the CXOs out there, especially with all the way that the CISOs are now approaching this and educating their users, educating them on the risks. And the risks are no longer in a workplace anymore, right? The risks are everywhere. A user does the same behavior at home with their finances, with their banking access, as they do at work. And if we start putting them together, you can reach people a lot, I guess, easier because you hit them right where it hurts. And when you think about it in this way, and you think about it as a journey, and you take it one bite at a time, it becomes a lot easier.
Got it. Okay. So obviously, you can't get out. You can't have this conversation without talking about money, right? Because what does it mean for the budget? How hard is it going to hit me? What should we expect as part of the zero trust? As part of the zero trust journey. And so, James, talk a little bit from an identity and systems perspective as it relates to the budget side of the equation, based on what you've seen with some of our clients, and then we'll work through a couple different dimensions around various areas.
So what we've been seeing through organizations is that many organizations actually have access to this tooling already, given their licensing either through any number of vendors. But without that kind of push towards that model, they just don't use it and don't implement these solutions. The cost, unfortunately, will vary wildly depending on kind of how far away you are as it relates to those services and how difficult of a lift it's going to be to convert applications that may not support that model and basically forcing it into that model, either through any number of mechanisms, which I'm trying not to go into too technical detail, but it's just how I'm built.
He's a technical guy, in case anybody didn't know.
So the pricing will really vary extremely depending on what your current solutions are. If I can say one thing, though, it is infinitely more important to find solutions that communicate with each other than to have the best in class that are all siloed out, by far. And I can't stress that enough.
So, Kermit, James talked a little bit from the kind of identity side. What about the network side? There's a lot going on there. And so just curious to get kind of your perspective, and maybe it's Fortinet, maybe it's just you, but that sort of how you guys are thinking about it as this whole definition of network has really radically changed.
Well, there's a couple of things. I think Itzik brought up a good point, right? If there's not a journey to get there, and they don't see that it's a step-by-step, they just see the dollars involved. I think you have to show them that. And that starts with a risk assessment. And it's funny, at least in my market, they are afraid. They can get free risk assessments from CISA, yet they refuse to do it. I think because they're afraid of losing their job. Because if you don't know where your gaps are and you don't know your highest risk, that's what you should be starting with along that journey. So typically where I start with that, though, is I ask them what the cost is if they don't do anything. Because in my environment, it's very political. They don't want to be headline news. Nobody does, but it's even more when you're dealing with state and local governments or federal governments, it's even worse. But I just ask them overall, what would it cost if you don't do it? And there's been many examples out there that you can bring up to that. And it does change the dynamics when you say, what's it cost if you don't? And then have you done a risk assessment? And are you aware of your larger risk out there? Because that's where you should start.
John, since you live in the healthcare world, not exclusively, but fairly exclusively, and you're talking about a highly regulated industry with, really high legal standards around protecting information and real consequences if you don't. What's this looking like? What's the perspective within that particular vertical around this journey idea that we're talking about and the need to spend money, or the understanding that we need to be spending money?
Sure. So what's the cost if you don't? Well, it's pretty easy for me to answer that in healthcare, because in healthcare, the average cost of a breach is in excess of $10 million now. It's the most expensive industry anywhere in the world, U.S. healthcare, to have a breach. A lot of that is because of the regulatory world we live in. It's class action lawsuits that are driven as a result of breaches. It's a lot of different elements that result in that. So the cost is quite substantial. From a regulatory perspective, we have HIPAA, and what HIPAA really tells me at the end of the day is that I need to take steps that are reasonable and appropriate for my organization, given the risks involved, to manage the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the information. And what the recent history has shown us is that the steps that have been taken traditionally are insufficient to protect that data effectively, right? We have more breaches every year impacting more patients, more patient records. The cost keeps going up. So what's reasonable and appropriate in today's world? Well, what's reasonable and appropriate is different than it was 10 years ago. And what's reasonable and appropriate now is a lot of the concepts that we've been talking about today. And so, but you're also talking about an industry that is slow to change, that has historically underinvested in cybersecurity in particular. And if you have to start with knowing what I have, we may get nowhere because none of them know what they have. So, a lot of challenges, a lot of work to be done in that space in particular.
And it's a moving target as well, right? It keeps changing. Like we did today, right? It's all of those pigeons and rabbits. It continuously moving, and unless you go with it, you're going to be left behind.
An interesting element, despite the fact that healthcare has been highly regulated, and it's been regulated for over a decade now with HIPAA from a cybersecurity perspective, the insurance companies moved the needle more in the last 2 years than the federal government did in a decade, simply by saying, hey, we're not going to give you cyber liability coverage
Funny how
unless
that
you
works.
get MFA. Like, whoa, that one went right up to the CEO, right? I mean, it's like, wait, what?
Nobody ever said healthcare companies didn't understand risk transfer.
Yeah, exactly.
I think, Travis, you kind of already hit on this from your perspective. Any kind of follow-up thoughts?
Yeah, I would say we've been talking about the journey along the way to get to this point. Underwriters have gotten a lot more creative in the last couple of years as well. So I'll give you a prime example. If you have an account that's a true middle market account, maybe has loss history or doesn't have the best controls in place, a year and a half ago, it was a straight decline. You couldn't secure coverage, or if you were, it was just atrocious terms. Now what you're seeing is a lot more creativity in the sense that there's risk management timetables, where an underwriter will put the controls in the endorsement that they want to see implemented within a certain time frame after the policy inception. And we'll work with resources to get the insured to that point where they've implemented MFA for remote access, email. I mean, quite frankly, there's still accounts that don't have multi-factor authentication for simple purposes like that. But the underwriter will at least assess it, put terms in place. It may not be favorable terms, but then what we'll do is we'll negotiate with those markets, those carriers, to where once the terms and the controls have been met and are put in place, we can then adjust terms midterm in order to increase limits back to an appropriate manner and things along those lines. So a lot more creativity along the way, whereas 2 years ago, it was a straight decline. There's nothing we could do about it. And unfortunately, you're going to have to go bare until you can get to a point where your controls are adequate enough to be underwritten by certain markets.
And I think that industry there within itself can help as well, because that's been a moving target. Usually where my customers come in, they're like, they just don't understand what the insurance companies are looking for, because we've got tools that we can put in place that can run an automated report that shows the compliance. And going back to where do you start and how do you get around the money? Well, wouldn't that be nice if you could run a compliance report to find out what my insurance premium is going to be without having to go through and do something manual? So I think once that settles down and they get those controls in place they want to see, granted, you're right, it will change with a new product. However, it's baseline it now. So at least industry can start putting those automated reports in place to help the customers.
Yeah, and I think what we've seen is an insurance industry that has gone to school on cybersecurity controls that 2 or 3 years ago, or certainly pre-COVID, they didn't have anybody that really understood. They couldn't have sat up there and had this conversation either. That wasn't something they knew. So they've had to learn after getting their butts kicked about this stuff as well. So with that, I want to close it out and move to questions. Again, we've got a wealth of experience up here across a variety of across different ranges, right? From the consulting side, strategic leadership, device, identity and access, network, and insurance. So now's your chance for free advice. So raise your hands if you've got a question. I'm shocked that Bayless has a question. Who would have thought?
So now that the landscape has changed and we're looking at going to a zero trust model, and it's different from the legacy days where we controlled VPN and it was typically done on premise with hardware, we controlled everything, and now you're going to third-party services. How do you put your trust in the third-party services, for example, single sign-on and MFA, when you have a company like Okta that's had 3 major breaches in the last 2 years and have leaked credentials that you're counting on them to protect? So how do you go about knowing that who you choose to help you on the zero trust journey is going to do their job and protect your data and your credentials as well?
I'll start out with that because at the Fortinet Championships, we had a couple federal folks that were out there talking about some industry or some legislature that's going to go out. I see at least 3 Fortinet shirts out there. They'd be more than happy to come up with an Okta solution for you if you like. But I think what you're going to see is, it was very interesting, and it'd be interesting to hear my panel's view as well. There's actually talk of writing legislature that will hold software companies liable. So in cases like that, Okta will then be held liable if they put out known bugs in software. Now, that's going to be a steep uphill
change.
battle, right? Because how do I know I've put out a known bug, right? Knowingly. So that piece, legislature-wise, is going to be a tough. But it's interesting. You have a lot of people talking about that. Now, how quickly it moves, if it moves at all, will be interesting. But you are starting to see where people are talking about cyber development first, and then writing legislature to make software companies liable if they willingly put out buggy code that allows an event to happen.
Yeah. So you've, of course, teed up probably the most difficult problem
I disagree.
in cybersecurity today, right? With that one.
Yes. I knew I could count on James.
So great. I mean, what do people do today? They do things like send the vendors 400 questionnaires to try to understand what their security program looks like. They do things like security scorecard and BitSight that scan the public surface to try to understand whether or not they have good cyber hygiene, and half the times the stuff that they find isn't even real. It's false positive stuff, and none of that stuff works. I mean, it's not effective enough to really help us understand the amount of risk we're taking by introducing that third party into our environment. I'd suggest to you, I would suggest to you today that I would be comfortable bringing a case against someone if I think that they knowingly or recklessly introduced, known security weaknesses into their product and put that out. I think that's an easy case to make today. Whether or not they were negligent in doing it, it's a little tougher to prove. We have the cases like the SolarWinds cases right now that are getting a little spicy. The SEC is going directly around personal liability on the CISO. We have SEC regulation coming out right now, at least for publicly traded organizations, where requiring risk management at a board level and a risk management plan, and understanding cybersecurity and having cybersecurity experience at a board level. So, those things I think are helpful, but at the end of the day, whether it's my security or the security of a third party that I'm introducing into my environment. There's no 100% guarantees as far as I know. And so we're all trying to collect as much information as we can to make as informed a decision as we can, and hoping for the best at a certain point, I think, right now.
James, you had a disagreement. I got to hear what.
Absolutely.
Got to hear it.
You had no disagreement. I provoked them.
Thank you, Brian.
So Okta, as everyone in here knows, is an identity provider. Now, one key aspect of zero trust is that identity is nothing more than one element that is analyzed against every access to a service provided by your organization. So to answer your question as to how do you handle a Okta support personnel handing out their creds because they got social engineered, which is my understanding the most recent compromise
Most likely
was that.
that's what happened.
Yeah. Well, you don't rely solely on identity to provide access. It's not any harder than that. Because, for example, yes, they may have compromised that identity, but are they using a known and compliant device provisioned by your organization? If that's not telemetry that's being analyzed in your access to resources, you done messed up, buddy.
But doesn't that go out the door with BYOD?
No,
Yeah,
not if done correctly.
Yeah. So here's the thing. So I love these analogies, right? So I'm not. You guys probably figured this out by now, but I'm not particularly bright. So I have to put these things in a context that I can kind of understand. And I had that, the walled city with the neighborhoods walled off and this town's walled off and so forth and so on. I think you get the point of that. And that's how I kind of understand zero trust. But the part I didn't get to is, there's a bouncer at every one of those gates, and the bouncer's checking whether you're in the list, your identity, whether you're in that access control list. But that's not all he's doing, right? He's looking at where you came from. Where are you from? Let me check your passport. Where have you been? What kind of car did you come in? Hey, I'm going to have to check you for viruses. And that's that contextual information we're trying to collect. We're trying to collect as much of that as we can. And the good thing about that is, from a user perspective, you should be able to collect a lot of that stuff about me without having my input. So that's where the single sign-on really helps, is because the single sign-on takes away that part that's a burden on me as a user, where I have to plug in the stuff and then I got to remember where my phone is so I can get the number. And every freaking one of those multi-factor authentication authenticator apps looks exactly the same on my phone. They're all the blue lock thing, and I don't even know which one does what. And so it's really a pain in the ass.
And they're all called authenticator.
Right? Yeah. So the benefit of this is, with all that other contextual information, there's a dynamic policy. So we used to have these static policies. You go up to bouncers like, are you on the list or not on the list? And if you're on the list, you get in, and if you're not on the list, you don't. Well, now they're gonna evaluate all these other contextual elements, all these other things that they know about me and where I've been and where I came from and what device I'm using and is it patched and all that stuff. And based on all that information, they're gonna make a decision, a risk-based decision on whether to let me in. But it's even better, because then when I'm inside, there's going to be this guy hovering over me, seeing what I'm up to. And if I'm up to suspicious shit, he throws me the hell out. That's my understanding of zero trust architecture in a nutshell.
I want to emphasize something that James said before. It's zero trust, particularly in the architecture, is a multitude of actions you take. And it's not just technology. So yes, the device needs to be trusted. If the device is not trusted, then it doesn't matter whether the user is trusted or not, you won't have access. So those are just two factors, which are technology factors. But one of the critical part of it, like I mentioned before with the change and adoption management, is the user training. Users must be educated what actually that means to them. And not just from a work perspective. What I mentioned before, those same behaviors, when they take them home and they do that at home, they're actually much more at risk. Right? So it's very important. I think that's a way to get the users to understand why their role in here is critical. Whereas in the past, we used to have, if you have a username and password, you in. If you have a username and password and we had a firewall, great. Then we introduced the DMZ. So now you've got 3 layers you need to go through, but now it's not. But once you're in, you're in. And what we also know, and I can't remember the exact statistics, but it's something like 75% of breaches are done from inside. So it doesn't matter that someone got your MFA, as long as they're inside. That's right. That's right. But what comes next is the fact that we talked about least privilege. Even if you did go in, you're going to get less permissions than you used to have, because now you've got only what you must have, and for a short period of time. So you might not prevent the breach. We know that breaches are assumed to have occurred, but you will prevent the impact of them a lot quicker.
It would seem to me that if we had a critical mass of zero trust implementations, industry, just say universally speaking, right? If zero trust we really got to where it's not an end state, but we're further along the road, we wouldn't necessarily see the number of breaches go down, but we'd see the impact of those breaches shrink significantly. Is that a fair? Maybe we see them go down at some point, but in the interim, I mean, I think Brian's point that this change from legacy to sort of the modern workplace is maybe the only thing that Microsoft has come up with naming wise. It's actually half decent. The modern workplace, right, where you don't have a VPN, you've really moved away from legacy tooling, right? Until that point, you're going to continue to have breaches, but what you're trying to do really is reduce the surface area of those breaches.
Following on with my analogy, if I start some shit in the room, I'm only in the room. I'm locked in the room.
Right.
So that's the only place I can create trouble. So that's reducing the blast radius.
Right. Hang on.
I just got one more element to add, and that's purely from a technical perspective. As it relates to BYOD, you do have options that still allow you to know that it is a device owned and controlled by your staff. And you have BYOD enrollment types. Android has their work profiles. iOS has their account-driven enrollments. You can use those solutions to get that device registered and known to your environment and enforce its compliance, such as no jailbroken, actually up to date, et cetera, without risking deletion of personal data, while still allowing you to control the data that's on that device from an organizational perspective and wipe it in terms of compromise, termination, et cetera. Because the entire idea of the zero trust model, well, not the entire idea, but one of the huge benefits of it is that regardless of where you are or what device you're on, your access and the data that you have access to can be removed at any moment.
And what you can do with it, whether you can download or forward it or email it, all of those controls are now critically important here because they are the ones that are going to bring the risk down after the breach has already been happening.
Questions? Let's get another question.
And make them hard this time.
Yeah. One that has a more complicated answer than the last one.
No, I just want to tee up.
Can you introduce yourself real quick?
Sorry, I'm Steve Thompson with TCW. Those clay pigeons, some of them got away today, but maturity model. But teeing off of what you just said, James, and going off the idea of John with the room concept. Okay, I'm locked in a room. How to destroy the token that was authorized once I decide that this guy, he authenticated somehow, he's a bad guy, he's locked in a room. How do we proactively kill that active session of the bad guys?
So one of the benefits of the token authentication mechanism is that you can revoke it on the server side. So in those situations, if you did have a compromised token, you would issue a revoke on those. I'm not sure if that answers your question. If not, you may need to be a little bit more particular in terms of the operating system, the service being accessed, et cetera.
Yeah. Second question, sorry, buy one, get one free. So for those of us who, and I love the analogy about our equipment, in the new network and there is no network, where we have resources everywhere now. So when we develop APIs into third party or our customers or our vendors, things like that, how do we secure that, right? Something that's not in my control, but it's definitely mission critical information.
So your question is, how do you secure APIs that you produce that your vendors and or clients would be using? Or run me through the workflow. Are you hosting the APIs or are you accessing APIs that are client provided?
The latter.
The latter, okay. So that would actually fall more on their security mechanisms. Obviously, if they issue you a bearer token for API access and that gets leaked, obviously that's on their kind of security kind of setup. So I'm not entirely sure what all you could do from your perspective. I mean, if you got ideas.
I think John touched on it before. What we do today is we actually analyze our providers. We go in and assess what they do to protect themselves and me. And if they don't do enough, and if I'm not satisfied that they are protecting enough their API access, I won't use them. I'll find someone else.
I think that's the best you can do at this point.
Audit the vendors.
Yeah. I mean, if it's mission critical and you don't like their security, you need to have a little heart-to-heart with the business and let them know what you're dealing with here.
Now, having said that, just because I got a couple seconds to think on it for a second, there are alternatives to that. So for example, if you were to implement an API management solution where you're rewriting tokens, by that I mean that you're hitting your service, which is then just being redirected to that vendor, you could issue user-assigned tokens and allow the API management just to rewrite it to the real one. And then you're getting in a good spot where you could easily kill off someone's token access. They can't use that service anymore because they've never had access to the actual bearer token used. And I can run you through that, but that's how I would
you're
tackle
getting into
it.
the security, you're getting into the authentication development business. Just keep that in mind, right? You know.
But I want to take both questions though and bring it back around to something you said earlier that you never expand upon. And that goes back to, as you're looking at the telemetry across the entire spectrum, how valuable it is to have the telemetry that you can get off each device along the way. So you asked one point in time, myself or Fortinet, I'll tell you right now, when you go back and you look at the fabric, what we call our fabric, what Gartner calls the mesh, one of the valuable things that you do get out of that is each device within, I'll say, the zero trust architecture and or your cyber architecture, that telemetry is being shared across those different devices. So if it's identity management that gets compromised, that telemetry goes out and that will help isolate. If it's API compromise and you've got security measures put in place, you should be able to isolate it. And that telemetry is shared across the entire environment, not just within, if it's the data center or from one security network product to the other. The other devices know as well. The other thing that no one's asked about is, what about AI machine learning, where you're actually learning what should or should not be done just by the actions that are being taken place. Should a remote, if I know it's a confidential document and the user is downloading it, are we going to know as an administrator? Probably not. But you can put that intelligence into the network somewhere or the cyber mesh, and you can prevent that from happening and or flag it. So you're starting to see a lot of end-user based authentication as well.
I'm going to just expand on that just a smidge. One of the main benefits that we're also kind of seeing is the amount of time savings involved for IT staff relating to security incidents and investigating those incidents. Because with, and apologies, I've lost my thought now. Dang it.
Response time.
Is what you were saying?
Yeah.
You were going to say Fortinet? I'm just trying to help you. That was awesome.
Oh, man. Yeah, no.
It'll come back to you, Jay.
I lost it. Sorry, guys.
Go ahead, John.
Lost my thought.
Welcome to the club.
Something in the water.
I know. I'm back now. I'm back. So I thinking about the API thing and the Okta situation and the third-party risk, one of the things that you want to incorporate into your contextual decision-making is threat intelligence, right? So there should be a feed into there monitoring what's happening out there in the greater world. So when compromises at vendors and those types of things or specific types of attacks are known by the threat intelligence folks, they feed into your system and you can take appropriate action. One of the big challenges we have, and this is probably not unique to healthcare, but it's definitely in healthcare, is something like that will happen, right? The Okta thing will happen, or some other vendor will have some problem, and we contact our healthcare customers and they're like, well, we don't know whether we really have that or not. And then there's a whole exercise trying to find out whether or not they have that third-party technology, because they don't, right from the get-go, know what they have in a lot of cases. And again, not just from a zero trust journey perspective, but from a security perspective, that's the first step is what is it that we have that we are trying to protect. So
I actually remember what I was going to say. So you'd mentioned AI and behavioral analytics. One of the benefits to this in terms of time saving for IT staff is the presentation of what I would call actionable information versus just information. We see many organizations using an SIEM and having all this telemetry data stored somewhere, but it's so much that unless you have full-time staff kind of combing through it, you're not accomplishing anything. You don't need to know that Susan in accounting reached out to an accounting share on a network. You need to know if Susan in accounting reached out to the IT share or somewhere she doesn't normally go. that's actionable information, not just raw telemetry data. And I feel like these models facilitate that a lot more, because we do see many organizations that just pipe all their logs into a central place and say, nailed it.
We got time for one more question before we get to the bar. Who's going to ask the last question?
The insurance guy, it seems like insurance can drive more security adoption. Why is the insurance industry not helping to push security solutions through the underwriting process?
They're attempting to, but it's not very tangible, it feels like. So prime example, John, you touched on it earlier. Everyone's using BitSite reports, vulnerability scans of your online presence. There was a period in time there where a lot of underwriters were declining risk based off of those findings, and then we would then have to present that to the insured and go, look, tell us where this is inaccurate, and it comes back and everything is inaccurate about their findings. So it was a huge exercise that was a giant waste of time. It's since have shifted. There's been a lot more partnerships that have taken place with different vendors, or Okta being one as a prime example, where the insurance company has partnered with Okta to where they can offer discounts or things along those lines towards memberships, subscriptions, et cetera, that are all designed to help get the insured into a better cyber hygiene perspective. A lot of the issues right now, and I could go on a total tailwind on this, so keep me in line here. There was a lot of insurtech companies taking on a lot of money that were growing, and the intentions was to get to the point that you're speaking to. Problem is it's not as simple to raise capital right now. And so a lot of the layoffs that are taking place within these cyber insurtechs are in the IT-related department, the risk engineering departments. And it's because at the end of the day, they were getting these crazy evaluations, bringing on a lot of money, because their end goal was to be exactly what you're speaking to. They don't have the controls. We're going to implement the controls, therefore making it a better risk, therefore loss ratios down, more profitability. Where all the layoffs are taking place with a lot of these insurtechs right now is in those departments, because at the end of the day, they're an insurance company. They're only keeping a percentage of the premium. And unfortunately, there's not enough money there right now to continue those efforts.
On that, we're going to wrap it up. I think to summarize, I hope, the goal, as you could tell, we want to kind of cover the basis of what Zero Trust architecture is, sort of where it came from, kind of how we got to where we are, and then try to surface some of the key issues that hopefully you guys, maybe you're not dealing with any of them, maybe you're just smooth sailing. If you are, outstanding. That would make you in the distinct minority, I can assure you. But for most of us, right, these are challenges, and where you are on this journey varies pretty significantly. And so I hope we've covered the bases to give each of you at least a little something to think about and hopefully take back with you as you leave here and go back to your workplace. With that, I'd like everybody to join me and give a hand to the panel for joining us today.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you are enjoying the podcast, we'd appreciate it if you would become a subscriber wherever you get your podcasts. And if you could rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, that would really help us out. Or you can just go old school and tell your friends, your family, your colleagues, and hell, anybody else who you think might want to hear something like this to listen in. If you're on social media, make sure to follow us on TikTok @CutTheShitPod, all one word, where we post lots of clips from the podcast. And last but not least, you can also watch the YouTube version of the show on our YouTube channel @Plow Networks. Until next time, take care and have a great day.